So it is lesson 3, part 2. We've talked about NPM. We've done a little node exercise. So I want to go over just a few important things about JavaScript that are going to be relevant in our course. So these slides are up here on Blackboard. Not going to read them to you. They're more here for reference. But a few things that we should be aware of in terms of our syntax and JavaScript structure, right? So JavaScript, remember, it's case sensitive. It ignores white space. Our statements end with a semicolon, for example. Identifiers, typically we're going to use camel case for identifiers. So variable names, constants, functions, objects. It can be any length. Case sensitive, can't start with a number. And identifiers can only use letters, numbers, underscore, and the $sign. You can't use other characters, for example, in a variable name in JavaScript. This is kind of a handy chart. It's a list of reserved words. So JavaScript has lots of them. So you can't name a variable or a function with any one of these reserved words, or you're going to confuse the JS interpreter. Even though JavaScript is not fully object-oriented, it still uses object notation. So object name and then a dot to call a method, or to reference a parameter would be object dot property name. Okay. Another thing to note when we're working with numbers in JavaScript, unlike languages like C# or Java that makes a distinction between a number with a decimal and a number with a whole number, JavaScript doesn't care. So it simply has a number data type, and it infers whether we're working with integer or decimal. So in JavaScript, if you want to add 1.5 and 9 together, JavaScript can do it. In C#, you're going to get a type conversion error. You're going to have to convert both of those to decimals in order to be able to do math with them. JavaScript, no problem. It's more flexible. So it has some notions of data types, but it's loose. It's not strict. We got floating point numbers, strings, booleans, blah, blah, blah. I think we know regular kind of math operators. Here, nothing new. Plus, plus for add 1, minus, minus, decrease 1. And also just a chart here on the order of preference. We're doing a complex calculation. So here, we actually hit on this last week. Right? If we're concatenating, we use a plus sign, but in JavaScript, we use the plus sign both for concatenating strings and for adding numbers together. So we ran into this scenario last week in our tax calculator. So if we have two values, one's numeric and one is a string, and we put a plus sign, JavaScript is going to concatenate them as a string. In order for them to be added, it has to know that these are both numbers. So some different numeric examples here with the different operators. And again, all of this is on Blackboard as a reference. Some of our common escape characters, so it's \n for new line, or we want to escape quotes, for example. We just put a \/ in front. So we can use parse int and parse float. We used parse float last week in our tax calculator. Right, we wanted to make sure that when we were adding our subtotal and our tax, we wanted to make sure the JavaScript interpreter converted this to a number, to floating point number. So we used parse float because it has a decimal. JavaScript also has, and we'll see this, I don't know, have you, Justin, I know you mentioned it last week. Have you guys worked with the triple equals operator before? Or is that new? Seen it a few times? A little bit? Okay, Justin, you've tried it. So in a nutshell, what is it? What does triple equals do? Right, Rudia. So double equals is comparing two values to see if they're equal. Triple equals also tells you if they have the same data type. So I think I'm going to have some other examples here. We've got our logical, our not, and an or with the double pipe. No, I thought I had some examples in here of triple equals. I guess I don't. So right, as Justin said, it's comparing the values and the type. And this is actually used in Node code quite a bit. So we'll see it in a fair number of examples. Also description of anonymous functions, which we're starting to work with. These code samples are a little old because it's still in the old version of JavaScript, we used to have function and then bracket bracket. The new version, it just looks like what we did in our for loop. Instead of including the word function before the parameters, we just use the lambda. This kind of replaces the keyword function instead. So it's shorter to type. So this is more modern JavaScript syntax than having this anonymous function keyword. Now we're going to skip over the arrays. Okay, so this is more here as a reference. I don't really think there's new stuff in here, but it's a good reference, good place for you to go and quickly check some of your basic JavaScript rules and syntax if you need it. So this little exercise was designed, to get you writing a little bit of JavaScript on your own, also to review some of the things we've talked about with Node already in this class in terms of requiring and using the request and response callback. I'm going to give you your lab now, and then we're going to move on to routing. And I'm also going to show you just a couple of other, actually just for the lab, a few other little JavaScript resources here that are helpful, some of which you may have seen before, some of which you haven't. So JSBin is cool. Anybody used JSBin before or seen this site? Okay, JSBin is just an alternative. It lets you write and execute JavaScript in your browser. So it's got different windows here. It's got an HTML, you can add CSS. But if I just turn on the JavaScript and the console, you know, I can do things here. So I can write, yeah, it's kind of like CodePen. It's pretty much the same thing, Nick. So if I wanted to do something like, again, we could try out our equals 1, we'll just say less than or equal to 20. So here's our loop. And then it's got a console window. So if I wanted to try this JavaScript out, I could type it in the JavaScript window, and then I can run it, and I can see, I get my console output here. I could clear it, for example, and run things. So it's a quick, easy way to test out small kind of snippets of JavaScript, similar to CodePen. So that link is here. This might be useful for you. Couple other links I'm just going to show you. They're sort of long. Interesting discussion here about scoping in JavaScript, when to use var, when to use let. So relative, you know, this sort of describes some of the distinctions with some code samples. Yeah, I've used CodePen a little bit, Nick, but it's been a long time, so I'm not too familiar with it. So there's a good description here of the difference between what you can and can't do. So for example, var, you can redeclare the same variable in the same scope, whereas let won't let you do this. So some good samples here explaining the differences. And also an article on typing in JavaScript, data typing. Another interesting discussion. So it's untyped because we don't declare There's some debate in this discussion about, is it loosely typed or is it untyped? I would argue it's actually loosely typed. This developer says or Mozilla claims because we don't declare a data type with a variable, it's untyped. But to me, untyped means there's no such thing, no notion of data types at all. JavaScript does have notions of data types. It can perform math that, it infers data types. So I would argue it's loosely typed or weakly typed. There is a type. It's just that it's kind of implied. It's not explicit. So I tend to agree with the developers who say it's weakly or loosely typed compared to C#. So this has implications for, how we use variables in JavaScript and in our Node code, as well as when we work with a front-end framework like Angular, like you did with last semester, many of you did with Albert in your in the class where you used Vue, or if you're using something like React. So all these rules around JavaScript, they apply in all of these elements. Okay, so those resources are here for you. Let's have a quick look at the lab. You get to make a game. So you're not actually using Node at all. It's just a little JavaScript exercise. So I've suggested you can use JS bin. You don't have to, it's an option. So if you want, you could just use that JS bin site to do your coding. So you're gonna make a little JavaScript rock, paper, scissors game. So JavaScript has a function called prompt. It pops up a little dialog box with a text input where the user can type something. So you're going to use prompt and ask the user, and you can put a message in there. You want them to type in rock, paper, or scissors. And whatever they type in, you're going to store that in a variable called user selection. You're then going to use another built-in JavaScript function called math.random. This will give you a number, a decimal number, somewhere between 0 and 1. So if this and you'll store that in a variable called computer selection. And then here are the rules. If the computer selection is between 0 and 0.34, the computer selection is paper. If it gives you a number between 0.35 and 0.67, the computer selects scissors. And if it's 0.68 to 1, it won't be any higher than 1, then the computer selects rock. So you should then display in the console what did the user enter and what was the computer's randomly generated weapon, paper, scissors, or rock. So it should say, like user chooses paper, computer chooses rock, for example. And then you need to use a series of decisions to determine, did the user win, did the computer win, or is it a tie? I assume everybody knows the rules of rock, paper, scissors. If you don't, then please ask me and I will clarify. But just to note, paper will beat rock, scissors will beat paper, and rock will beat scissors. So then the console should display user wins, computer wins, or it's a tie. So once your game is working, just copy your code if you're working on JS bin. Copy your code into a file called lab1.js, make a private repository on GitHub, call it COMP2106 Lab1, add me as a collaborator through settings and manage access. There's my username, IFOTN, for short for in front of the net, which is my company name. Push your file to this repository and then submit your repository link on Blackboard. Okay, so you have a week to do this. Are there? Yeah, Hung. We could do. We could do rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock, but we'll leave that out. Ross would be really proud if I changed it to that, but you'd have a lot more if statement to write in this case. So we'll keep it simple. Rock, paper, scissors. I think my students, when I was teaching in Korea years ago, they used to play. I think in Korean they call it kai bai bo. So Young, maybe you can confirm, is that right? Is it called kai bai bo in Korean? I think so. Any questions? Yeah, it was a long time ago. I remember that, from 1996. My students playing Kai Bai Bo. Any questions about the lab or what you need to do? Ravinder Beer, due by next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Okay, so you have 6 days. And then your quiz as well. Both are due at 5 o'clock next Wednesday. Okay, but you have 6 days to do them. Maybe, half an hour, 1 hour's worth of total work between now and then. Just review questions about the first 3 lessons. So just some of the fundamentals about Node and some of the things like callbacks and asynchronous code, basic stuff that we've been doing over the first 3 lessons. So if you've been coming to class, you've been, working on the files together, then you should be fine for the quiz. And any slides that I've shown, those are on Blackboard as well. Okay, so you have access to the resources. No, Maggie, you do not have to write any code. It's just short answer. Okay, so I might ask you a question like, what does the require function do in a Node file? No, it's not multiple choice, it's short answer. So you'll actually have to type in an answer. So you won't get a grade right away. I will actually grade them. And few questions are a little simpler. They're worth a few less marks. A few of the other questions are a little more advanced. So there's more marks for the harder questions. I think there's 8 to 10 questions maximum. So we'll do one of these every 4 weeks. Just a short answer review quiz about the previous 3 lessons, just to make sure that you're on top of it. All right. So let's have a look at routing with Connect. So we looked at the Node style guide already. We can jump over that. So these slides are here as well. We've already done our loop. So we're going to use an NPM package shortly called Connect. So Connect is designed to handle routing. And what I mean by routing is to interpret different HTTP requests and then know where to send each request. So in Node, this doesn't happen automatically, right? If you think about it, let me just open an older file here from last semester, just to put it in context, if we can compare to how .NET works. I think it's in, let's see. Here's our slides from last semester. No, it's the wrong one. Sorry, folks, bear with me. I'll get it right sooner or later. So in ASP.NET, our URLs have a predetermined pattern, right? We saw this last semester. So the first, we've got our base domain, our base URL, so the domain name. Wow, I'm really struggling this afternoon. Then we've got our controller name, method name, and then any parameters. So all this routing happens automatically. If our site's built on .NET, a URL like this, the server, it automatically knows with this URL that the orders controller is going to process this request, and it will automatically call a details method and pass in a parameter ID of 1,000. So this is all automated when we're working in ASP.NET. It is not automated. The routing is not automatic in Node. We actually have to configure each URL, which seems like a bit of a pain, and it kind of is compared to .NET, but it also allows us lots of flexibility. Okay, so we're going to use Connect so we can handle different requests and then route them appropriately, send a different response based on what kind of request comes in. So Connect is an API, it's middleware. It sort of sits in between So it's basically a set of callback functions that are executed when we get an HTTP request. So the middleware, we can run some logic, and then we can turn a response, and then we can even do something else. Like maybe we want to load a page and send an email, for example, or load a page right to the database. So Connect lets us do this. So we're going to work with Connect this week. Next week, we're going to use Express instead of Connect, but Connect is underneath. Connect is part of Express. So if we're going to use Connect in a basic way today, and then Express will be a little more advanced next week. So this is kind of a good introduction. So Connect uses this dispatcher object. It's a way of determining what is each HTTP request and then what to do. And it's got a cascading, it's got like an order of what order do things happen in when we get a certain request. It's actually pretty easy to work with. So our code's going to look something like this. So next week we'll work with Express, but because Express under the hood uses Connect, starting with Connect is a good way of kind of leading into Express. So we're going to write a really simple file, something like this. We're going to install Connect from npm. We're going to create a new Connect application. This part is similar, kind of a shorter version. We're going to listen on port 3000, and we're going to log out a message. So this will be kind of our starting code, what we want to do. So we're going to install Connect in a minute. In fact, we can do that now. So let's go to our terminal. I'll hit Control-C because I think my server was still running my for loop. If I want to clear out the terminal, I can type CLS. So now we want to install Connect. So we can run the command npm I connect. We don't need to install it globally. It's only going in this project. So we don't need the -G. So I'm going to install Connect with npm I connect. And now we can see Connect is installed here in our node modules folder. So I'm going to make a new file for today. We'll right click, let's make a new JavaScript file. We'll call it server.js. And we're going to use this simple code that's on the slide. Oops. Let's make this a little bigger. So we need 4 lines of code. We're going to require Connect, create a new Connect application. So this is kind of replacing that instead of using Node's HTTP library to start an HTTP server, we're going to use Connect instead. So we'll require Connect. Create a new Connect app. And we're doing this instead of using the HTTP library, we're going to use Connect instead. We don't need the new keyword, so this creates a new object, new Connect application. So our syntax is a lot simpler here. We can just call app.listen on port 3000. And we'll log a message to the console. I don't even really need my semicolons here. WebStorm, I'll have to update my linting here because it complains, but I don't need them anymore in more modern versions of JavaScript. So here's my code. It is also on Blackboard. These slides are here. This is slide 9 in the lesson 3, routing with Connect. So I want to launch this. I think what we want to do, though, because we're going to start and stop this a whole bunch of times, I want to use Nodemon. So I'm going to make a change in my package.json because right now it's configured when we use Nodemon, it will run, right? Our main file here is tax.js. So I'm going to change my package.json. So the main file is actually server.js. So I'll put this code up on paste bin, if that helps, if anybody needs it. So this code is shorter and simpler than using Node's HTTP library. It's also going to allow us to call different URLs. So add that code in your new server.js, go to your package.json, and let's update line 5, where the main is now server.js. And if I scroll down to the bottom, you'll notice it's added Connect. When we installed Connect, it's added it automatically to my list of dependencies. So if you download my repository, it will know that you need these 2 dependencies, the accounting package we installed last week and the Connect package we've just installed. Okay, so update your line 5 to server.js. And now we can try this out. So we'll go to our terminal. So how can we run this with automatic restarts? We want to try this out. Yep, we can do Nodemon, and we don't even need, we could put in server, but Hung is right. Server's optional because we're now saying the command should be server automatically. So we're going to run it. So it's starting server.js, and we get our message, which is great. So now let's try it out in our browser. So now I'm going to refresh, and we get this. Cannot get. What do you suppose this means? This is actually expected. So if you're getting a cannot get error, that's okay. You should. Why do you suppose we get this error? What would cannot get mean? Exactly, Justin. We can interpret requests at this URL, but we haven't provided any instructions. There's no response. We haven't told the server what should happen when a request comes in at this URL. So great answer, Justin. That's exactly right. And if we look at our slides, so we've done this. We've installed Connect. And when we run it, matches exactly. It says cannot get because we haven't registered any middleware to handle, so the default HTTP method is get. So it's running a get request here, but we haven't indicated what should happen. So we're going to use Connect to define what should happen. So we're going to have same parameters we've already seen. We've got request, response. We also have a next parameter, but most of the time we don't use it. So we'll go back and make some changes so we can now handle this request and write a response. So let's go back to our code editor. So what do we want to do here? We're going to create a function to handle HTTP requests. So let's create a variable I'll call hello world. And we're going to set it equal to an anonymous function, a callback with 3 parameters, request, response, and now we've got this next parameter. We're not really going to use the next parameter very much, but it's part of Connect, so I'll list it here. First, we'll send the response header. So this is going to be familiar to what we've already done, right? We'll call write head. We'll send a 200 OK with our HTML content type. Oops. And our encoding. Yes, the recording will always be available. Yep, that's no problem, Ravinder Beer. It'll be uploaded a little bit later today onto YouTube. And all the code will be published to GitHub. Okay, we'll see you next week. So we're going to write our header and write an HTML. Yeah, you too. So we'll response.write. I don't know, maybe an H4 that says, hello world. So we've now created a function to handle an HTTP request and send this response. Well, and I guess we need to call res.end. So if I run this right now, what will happen if we try the page now? I go back and Nodemon's restarted, which is what we wanted. What will happen if we refresh our browser now at localhost 3000? Will we get an error? Will we get cannot get? Will we get a blank screen? Will we get hello world? What do you think? Maggie thinks the same. Hung thinks we'll get hello world. Okay, so we still have cannot get. How come we're still getting this response? We've set up a variable to send a response. How come this code doesn't seem to do anything? It is actually correct code. Right, we're never actually calling it. Exactly, Maggie. We're setting it up, but it never actually gets called. So this is what I mean, that the dispatching or the routing, it's not automatic. So to fix this, so for this, we use app.use. So now any requests should actually call this function, which will then send our 200 header and our H4. So I'll save that change. Nodemon will restart. So I've just added line 20. And now we get our response. So this is sort of how Connect and Express work. We've got to map URLs to a particular well, for now to a function. Later we map them to a controller. We're still going to use an MVC framework. But you can see this happens manually. It's not automatic like it is in .NET. Right now, all requests, no matter what URL, all requests are automatically being sent. No, Nick, it's just sending a response. We will create actual view files in .NET. We'll start doing that next week when we use Express. Okay, Rudia, great question. What is next for? Let's go to NPM. Next is actually rarely used, but let's have a look at exactly what the docs for Connect say. So we've installed Connect, blah, blah, blah. So I'm trying to find where their explanation is. So next is optional. So we actually could leave it out. What next allows us to do is after we do these things, after we send a response, if there's something else we want to do when we get in this request, we can do it after by calling next. So for example, we might have error handling here. It's kind of like a callback. It's more to, because this can manage, Connect can manage a chain of events. So we can get the request and send a response, but then we could call something else. Like maybe we need to send an email or log something after we send a response. Next allows us to do this. So next is optional. Used to do something after the response. Does that help? So we'll use next only a little bit, but not very much in this course. Okay, so this sort of works, but it sends all requests. Notice whatever URL I go to, it just loads hello world every time. So this is like a one-page website. So we want to modify this a bit now. We want to create a goodbye world and then map different URLs to the different functions. So if we go to localhost/hello, the response should be hello world. But if we go to localhost 3000/goodbye, we want to call a different function that's going to print out goodbye world instead. Okay? So we're going to set out two different routes and start to map them. So I'm going to copy my hello world function. And I'm just going to change my variable to goodbye world. Very sad. And I'll change my response to also say goodbye. Okay, so two identical functions. So right now, only hello world is being mapped. So I'm going to change this mapping. I don't want to call hello world at all requests. What I want to do, I'm going to put this in, I'm going to map a particular route. So when the URL is localhost/hello, then we want to call hello world. So for the root goodbye, we want to execute our goodbye function instead. Okay, so we are now we have two paths. Each one will execute a different function and send a different response. We're actually almost done today, folks. We're just going to try this out. We're going to do one more thing with it, and then we'll call it a day. Okay, I don't think we'll need a full 3 hours of class today. Don't want to beat you up too badly. So we've got two functions, hello world that prints a hello world response, goodbye world that prints a goodbye world response, and we're mapping different URLs. Like I said, this is the piece that .NET does automatically. We can actually see this in a .NET site. I'll try it, my code in just a second. If we look back to our code from last semester, yes, Hung, it doesn't give you an automatic route. That's true. We'll look at that in just a second. So here, if we go look at our Get Me a Game from last semester, I think it's in Startup. So ASP.NET, it has this automatic mapping in Startup. Use endpoints, and the URL pattern is controller name, and then action name, and then parameter. So we're doing this manually in Node. This is what Visual Studio automatically gives us. You can change this, but it's here by default. So we're kind of doing our own manual version of this in Node. This URL is handled by this function. This URL is handled by this function. So now if I go to hello, I get hello world. If I go to goodbye, I go to goodbye world. But now we've got our old cannot get. How come this error came back? Hung, I think maybe this is the error you were talking about. So why did our error come back? Right, because we're now only mapping these two URLs. We're mapping localhost/hello and localhost/goodbye. But any other request doesn't know what to do. So we could do this. We'll make one more function. I'll call it index. Request, response, next. Just paste this in, and our H4 will just say, I don't know, connect homepage. So we want to map any other requests that aren't hello or goodbye. So here, we'll just say any requests at the root will go to index. So if the URL is /hello, call hello world. If the URL is /goodbye, call goodbye world. Any other requests, any other URLs, they'll just go here. Now this isn't ideal. We'll clean this up in a minute. I'll put all this up on paste bin as well because I know our file's getting a bit long. And then we'll try it out. Here's the new paste link if you need it. So now at localhost 3000, right, now we get the connect page. /hello. We get a hello message. Slash goodbye, we get a goodbye message. So all this is working properly, except for one thing. If I do this, right? Any request below, besides hello or goodbye gives me the home page. This is okay. But what would our other possible response be? Besides just giving them the home page if they do this. Yeah, right, Maggie. We could also check that, you know, at the root it says home. But if it's not, if there's anything else, we could go to 404. So we could add some logic in our index method. That if there's any other part of the URL after localhost 3000, we send a 404 response instead. We'll do that in just 1 second. There's one other gotcha here. This is a special path here. Notice there's no particular URL here. This is just a slash, anything at the root. If this is our default route, so this is our default route, if no specific URL given, this must go last. So Connect processes these URLs in order. I'm going to show you why it has to go last. If I make this first, so if I put my index root first, watch what happens. So it works, but hello, notice it loads the home page every time because there's a slash in all these URLs. So as soon as it encounters the slash, if this is first, it just calls index every time. So the order of the routing matters. So if we have like a default or a fallback route, it should go at the bottom after the other ones. So I'm going to put hello and goodbye first and index last. So we're going to make one other change here. As Maggie suggested, if the users put on any other URL after the slash or after the 0, we want to send a 404 response instead. So we're going to show homepage at but 404 if any other URL requested. So I'll just indent that, and we're going to wrap this in an if statement. So if our request.url is equal to the root, so equal to a slash, then we're going to do these things. We're going to wrap all this in a set of curly braces. Otherwise, our response is going to be a 404 not found. So this is going to be 404. And we'll print out a not found message instead. So any requests right at the root will say homepage. All the other requests will say 404 not found. This should do the trick. So a request in the root will say home. A request at hello will say hello world. A request at goodbye would say goodbye world. Anything else will give a 404 response. I'm just going to try this code out. And once it's working, I'll upload it to GitHub and set you free. So let's try this one more time. So 3000 works. I get the home page. Hello works. Goodbye works. And anything else gives me a not found. And if we look in our network console, right, we get 404, which is what we should get. So we have to process. Now you may be thinking, well, how is this going to work in reality? We build a web application with like dozens and dozens of pages. Do we map every individual URL like this? Yes and no. What we typically do is we map certain requests, the start of a URL, to a controller. And then inside the controller, we map the individual URLs to different functions in the controller. So it's a little more similar to ASP.NET in that case. But again, we do still have to lay out each URL manually. But we do it kind of one controller at a time. Okay, Hung, that's fine. Okay, I'm going to stop my code. So lesson 3 or 2, we used connect for routing. Well, I've uploaded, the code is all just uploading right now. It'll be done in a second to GitHub. You don't need the console log, but you do need the app.listen. That starts the server. Good question, Justin. If it's not listening, the server's not running. So the website will not be available without the app.listen. So that is required. The console log is totally optional. But I find it helpful because if we get an error, at least we know the server, whether the server's running or not when we're working locally in development mode. Okay, so you have your lab to do and your quiz to do, both due next Wednesday at 5 o'clock. I'll upload the recordings when we're done. Does anybody, all the code's available for you now. Anybody have questions? Hung, I'm happy to stick around and answer your question. Are there any other questions about working with Connect and the routing for today? You can probably see why we do ASP.NET before we do Node, because .NET automates a lot of things for us that we have to do ourselves when we're working with Node. All right, folks, that is all for today. IT is still working on our Project Studio Blackboard shell. They know there's a problem. Hopefully it'll be resolved for Monday. If not, we'll find a workaround. Just email your assignments to me if you can't submit them on Blackboard. Other than that, I hope you all have a great weekend. I'll see most of you Monday, and I'll see the rest of you next Thursday. Thanks for tuning in today. Okay, that's fine.